The Night Butcher Volume 2. How to describe this one? I would say Natural Born Killers meets Death Wish through the eyes of Rob Zombie. So this is actually a sequel of sorts to the 2023 movie The Night Butcher, and this was directed, written, stars and produced by MrJ. That's right. And I say sort of a kind of sequel because it really serves as somewhat of a reboot in some ways, because although it features the same characters as the original movie, it really doesn't follow on. And so I reviewed the original Night Butcher in 2023, and it was a grindhouse style sort of slasher movie. It didn't have a huge amount of story in it and was effectively a group of killers that were hiding out in this Halloween job, and a variety of people would kind of come in and get killed ultimately, and the Night Butcher would go on to sell the meat on the black market as human meat. So none of that is really referenced in this film outside of the relationship between the killers. The Night Butcher, played by MrJ, is kind of I suppose the leader of this gang, and he has this kind of girlfriend who is equally as psychotic. But in this movie, they're actually framed as the protagonists. So we learn in a kind of quite heavy exposition dump at the beginning of the movie that effectively the Night Butcher was the result of human trafficking, where his mother was kidnapped, and she was pregnant, and he was the result of that, and there was all of these kind of bad things that happened, and his kind of group of associates effectively from the kind of the same background. So now he's actually kind of going after the people responsible, and so he's kind of framed, and as the group is, as sort of getting revenge for these kind of past crimes. So it's somewhat of a revenge tale, and they're not really killing like just innocent people like they did in the original movie. So it's quite different in some ways. So that the film focuses on our main kind of two characters, really, the kind of the Night Butcher himself, played by MrJ, and his kind of girlfriend, as they are trying to effectively take out people associated with this kind of human trafficking ring, and then things don't go quite to plan, and pivots have to be made, so to speak. So that's kind of what I'll say about the kind of the plot here. So let's discuss what I think works in this movie. Now, we're going to be referring to the review of the original movie, because I do feel there's some things that have improved upon that were my critiques in my original movie. So one of the critiques was I felt there wasn't much in regards to narrative in the original movie, and that has changed, because this is kind of a revenge tale, and they have a mission in this one. We kind of know some backstory, we get the exposition, kind of we see flashbacks to the kind of the Night Butcher's mother and stuff. So we do get more information. There is more storytelling kind of going on in this movie than there was in the first film, which is one of my critiques of that film. Now, it's an interesting in a way, because these people, and if you do count the original certainly as sort of canon, it doesn't necessarily refute the events, but it's just very different in regards to the way these characters are depicted. But they are like extremely violent and psychotic people. But you, as I say, certainly in this film, if you were to only watch this film, they really don't go out of their way to harm anyone who isn't associated with this crime gang, so to speak. So, and they go on this kind of plan. Things don't go all that necessarily to plan, and we have various kind of confrontations with characters involved in this kind of human trafficking ring. So yeah, it's kind of a it's a revenge plot ultimately. So yeah, I would say that the plot of this one is improved. There are also some technical elements in this film that I think are improved from the first one. It's not perfect in regards to that, but there were some horrible editing choices in the original movie, which I feel is improved on this one. This movie has a bit more production value than the original movie. The original one was just in one location. It was just in this like one shop ultimately. We we have a variety of locations in this one, and the kind of the scope of the movie seems bigger. We have our human traffickers as characters, and they have their own plans, and we learn about this kind of like weird little family of kind of killers that's the Night Butcher and his crew, with various different kind of like shots. There's scenes in vehicles and stuff like that. There's also a lot of practical gore. So the original movie was quite gory, and this one I think ratchets it up a little bit. It borders on somewhat of an extreme gore in some aspects. It's not like realistic gore, but just to give you one example of the gore here, we see a guy getting tortured, and they decide to get his willy out, his winkle. And effectively, and you see all this, it's just not cut away from, and start cutting it and then drill a hole. You see all that. So, if you are somewhat squeamish, not that it's especially realistic, but, certainly the idea here is quite brutal. And that's just one example. It's lots of little moments like this through the movie where we have these moments of brutality. Now, some of the kills are people getting strangled and things like this, so it's not all like that. But when it does have some grotesque scenes, it is somewhat painful looking, let me just say. There's also a little bit of nudity, and I'm not just talking boobs here, for male and female, although I think it's somewhat special effects, you might say, on certain scenes. So it's the version I saw was an unrated one, so I don't know in the future if this would be maybe cut, because it does go quite hard in places. So there's certainly some improvements, I think, to the original film. There's still some artistic flourishes. Some of the kind of the shots here, they're kind of double exposed and things like this. So MrJ, as a kind of a filmmaker, I feel has evolved, but he also has his fingerprints on the movie in certain artistic styles. Like, you'll see the kind of like neon drenched, kind of like super saturated scenes. As I say, you'll have, sort of two scenes kind of blended in one over another, so you have a kind of double exposed sequences here and there. So there are some artistic flourishes, which gives it a certain sort of stylistic demeanour to it. It might be annoying for some, but I think it gives, like I say, certainly a stylistic choice by the kind of the filmmakers here. So, I think it kind of works for this kind of grindhouse sort of style movie that it is. And it's certainly an interesting idea to have such brutal characters. And again, certainly if you think of the first film, that are really here as our kind of people that we're meant to be kind of rooting for and kind of cheering on in some way. So, there is that. So maybe what doesn't work in this film, I think some elements of the original film seem out of place to a certain degree now. So the whole idea of the Night Butcher is that he is selling meat, he's the butcher. But that's not really ever referenced. So this really does feel like a kind of a reboot, to be honest. But minor point, because you might not have even seen the first one and not even care. So, whatever, I guess. There are some still technical elements where I feel there is still a little bit lacking. Some of the kind of the sound design here, I think, wavers and is not particularly good in audio. In actual fact, I had the subtitles on with this movie because some of the times I couldn't quite understand what was being said. But yeah, there's one or two kind of audio issues with this one, I would say. The music mixing is better. It's just some of the kind of the dialogue and things like that, I think, it still could do with a little bit of work. The artistic flourishes, I think, give the movie some stylistic cred, but I think maybe they
some of the scenes with it are a little bit too frequent or a little bit too long in certain scenes, and they kind of, it's very similar scenes each time is the best way I'll describe it. So it kind of feels, those particular scenes feel a little bit repetitive. Now, as the story goes, I think the actual narrative is vastly improved, because there really wasn't a narrative in the first one, if we're being honest. But even so, that being said, I still wasn't, the first act of the movie, I still wasn't 100% what was going on, because everyone just seems to be like a bad guy, and they're talking about kidnapping children, and then we have MrJ and his girlfriend, or the character of the Butcher and his girlfriend, go and meet this guy who's got this little girl, and they're talking about like pretending to kill her, and I'm thinking, I don't actually know what's going on. It doesn't really, the first act of this movie, I still wasn't quite sure about what was actually kind of going on. They've got this girl in the boot of their car called Stevie, and I thought, who's that? I don't know who that is. So I think the movie, after the first act, I do think the movie follows the narrative a little bit more clearly, but the first act, I was still a little bit, I don't quite follow what's supposed to be going on. And we do have a big exposition dump that kind of gives you the backstory, which sounds quite an interesting story to have as a film. I guess it's just a case of monetary, because what they had is a whole film in itself. But yeah, there is a big exposition dump. But again, it gives context, but at the same time, it's lots of telling, not showing. The budget is still quite low, and there are elements here that I feel you'll notice that. Some of the kind of the violence, and we're talking more about the kind of the fighting and things like this, just feels not particularly sort of well choreographed. It looks like a couple of friends kind of like jostling around rather than a kind of actual fight and things like that. So when we have our gore sequences where we have practical VFX, you know, great. When we have our characters scuffling and things, it doesn't really look that particularly impactful, and it kind of looks like a couple of guys just jostling around and things like that. Some of the acting is a little on the weaker side. You know, you might not care. This is very much a schlocky B movie. I don't think it's too concerned with having, you know, realistic performances exactly. But yeah, some of the kind of the acting, you know, it isn't. I'll be remiss for not sort of saying. And as I say, it kind of ignores certain elements from the original movie. And there are some elements here that I just think border on a little silly. We have our kind of our bad guys, you know, they, without giving any spoilers, they do something which is very typical of early James Bond villain, you know, films, where we have the villain sort of, I'll leave you to die, Mr. Bond, and I'll walk away and kind of like hope it all goes well. And it kind of does that, you know. So, and I have to say as well, on the subject of the antagonists, the villains, they seem to not put up a huge threat. I would have maybe liked to see a more genuine challenge for our group of very dangerous protagonists. Maybe having a guy who is equal or kind of like just as demented or something like that. There is one guy called Reaper who they position as the kind of the, you know, our main henchman. But when it comes down to it, the confrontation with him was a little bit underwhelming, is kind of all I'll say. The movie is clearly setting up a third instalment, and I have to say there's a reasonable twist. I won't say what it is. There's a reasonable twist in this movie, which I have to say I didn't see coming, which was you know, fair play to the filmmakers here. And you've got Felissa Rose in a very small role. She's relatively high billing, but don't go into this thinking this is a Felissa Rose starring movie. She's not in it a whole lot. Overall, this movie is still flawed. It's a very low budget film, so you have to be somewhat kind of forgiving to a certain degree. But it's kind of fun, and as I say, it's kind of like a Death Wish movie if the protagonist was Jason Voorhees. It's the best way I would, you know, try and kind of
help you visualize what this movie is actually like. So it's kind of an interesting movie where we have you know, masked slashers effectively as our protagonists and framed as the protagonists. So I kind of found this movie quite fun, but don't be expecting high polish. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. I had some fun with it. Have you seen it? Would you see it based on what I've told you? Please do let me know what your thoughts are, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.